Hello, my name is Paul Stroud. I'm an ITNM support engineer, and today we'll be creating a highly available NCIM database using DB2 HDAR. There are a couple of requirements. Working in populated DB2 ITNM NCIM database, you want to have already run a domain against this to be sure everything is populated properly. A secondary DB2 server running the same version of DB2 software as your primary, including the fixed pack level. An open port on both machines, preferably the same port if possible, to be used for HDAR communication. Note that DB2 HDAR is only available on 3.9 after FixPack 4. And if you search for ITNM DB2 HDAR template or visit the URL, you'll find the commands used in today's presentation. Here's our action plan for today. We'll shut down all the daemons, including the tip server, ensure there are no connections to the database, prepare the database for backup, backup the database, transfer the file and restore it on the secondary server, configure both databases for HDAR, start the database in an HDAR environment, catalog the nodes and database from the client, test the DB functionality, including the failover, reconfigure core and tip to use HDAR, restart ITNM, and test and confirm the failover functionality. Let's get started. Here I have 4 sessions. The top left session is my ITNM core server, root session. The lower session is a DB2 instance 1 session to my ITNM server. The upper right is Karma, our primary DB2 server, and on the lower right is Karma, our secondary DB2 server. You'll notice that both the servers have the same version, including the fixed pack level, and that our client is a different version, but that's okay. The first thing we need to do to get started is stop our daemons. Including tip. Now that our domain is stopped, let's go ahead and check the database for connections. Since there are no connections, we can continue. If you did have connections, you could do DB2 force application all and see if that releases the applications by testing the list applications again. If you still have connections, you'll want to consult with your DB2 administrator or the DB2 Knowledge Center online to find out how to break the additional connections. Since we have no connections, we can continue. The first thing we need to do is connect to the database so that we can make some configuration changes before we create the backup. I have the commands stored in a script, but we'll run them individually. Since we received an error on the last command, we'll have to deactivate the database before we make a backup. First, we need to terminate our connection, and then deactivate the database. Now that the database is deactivated, we can make our backup. Now that the backup is done, let's transfer it to the backup server. Once the file is done transferring, we can restore it on the backup server. Now that the database is restored, we can make the necessary changes for HDAR on both databases. Again, I have the command stored in a script, and this time we'll actually run the script. Again, since we received errors on the configuration changes, we'll want to deactivate the database before we continue. Now we can start the database in an HDAR configuration. First on the standby. And then on the primary. Now we can check the status of HDAR using DB2 PD. And that will show us the HDAR status of the database. You'll see that on our primary server, we are primary, we are in a state of peer, and that we are connected. On the standby, you'll see that our role is standby, we're in a state of peer, and we're connected. That means the database is currently up and ready for connection. First, we need to catalog the node and the database on the client. And then again for Carme, our secondary server. And now if we list the node directory again, we should see both those listed. The entries are correct as far as host name and service name, so we can continue. Let's catalog the database. And list the database directory. Notice the entry is correct and it's identified on Karma. However, our alternate server hostname and alternate server port number are empty. Once we make a connection to the database, those will be automatically filled in by the client. You'll notice we have to use the username and password here, and that's because we're coming in from the client. If we were connecting from the server itself, that would be unnecessary. Where we've connected to the database, let's list our DB directory again. And now you can see our alternate server hostname and alternate server port number are filled in automatically. Let's do a connection against, or a query against the database. So the primary server returned 62,290 count for the NCIM MIB objects table. Let's fail over the database to the backup server. Now that the takeover is completed, let's take a look at our DB2 PD command again. Now you'll see that the secondary server Carme is now the primary peer, it's in peer and we're connected, and that Karma is now standby, we're in peer and it's connected. Now if we run this query again, we'll receive an error stating that the established connection was broken but reestablished. So a connection failed but has been reestablished. The host name or IP address Carme and the service name or port number 50,000. So now we're connected to Carme, and if we run the query again, it will return the same value. But we got that value from the backup server. Let's fail back over to the primary server. and go through the process again. And if we run it again, it will complete. Make the necessary configuration changes. The only change necessary to have ITNM use the catalog instance is to change the port number from 50,000 to 0. That indicates to ITM to use the DB2 client catalog version of the database, which will allow us to fail over automatically. We also need to change the MIB DB login file and make the same change. Then we need to change 3 other files. The change we need to make here is much the same, though we provide a bigger URL. If you take a look at the URL, you'll notice that we're pointing to our primary Karma on port 50,000 to ITNM HDAR, our database, and then we list the client alternate server name and the client alternate port number. We need to make the same change here in our TNM properties file. And we need to make a similar change in our NC polldata.properties file. Now we've made all the changes necessary on both tip and core to get things started. Let's check the status of our daemons. So everything is up and running. Let's fail over the database to the backup. Ensure that it's on the backup with the role of primary. And let's see what happened in a daemon such as NCP model that keeps a constant connection to the database. And you can see that we lost connection to the database, but that it was reestablished. That concludes our presentation for today. Thanks for attending.